Napoleon accordingly found himself involved against his will in a gigantic expedition, which he would have preferred to postpone because later on it could have been carried out with better chances of success, if any longer necessary. He could not overlook the fact that the immutable tendency of the Russians since Peter the Great had been to exchange their icy climate for warmer skies, and their arid steppes for the rich and fertile provinces of Central Europe, to drive back the Russians into ancient Muscovy, and to raise up the throne to Poland to serve as a frontier to the states of Germany, and to act as the empire's bulwark against their invasions. Such was Napoleon's secret object, a result the realization of which was to be the corollary to, and the completion of the success of the continental system. It was to assure the success of this colossal enterprise that Napoleon succeeded in uniting under the French flag the whole of southern Europe. Unfortunately, the danger for him lay in so many precarious alliances, and it was in relying on these that his ruin was consummated. He blamed himself for this fault, which he himself called a clumsy one. It was indeed necessary for him to be absolute victor everywhere and always, and the day of a reverse must necessarily transform the allies whom victory alone kept under his flag into bitterest enemies. Matters had grown worse in Spain. The conquest of Andalusia by the French armies had forced the Sevilla junta to flee Cadiz. The time, it seemed, had come to push the war vigorously on at this point, and to profit by the dissensions which divided the councils of the Spanish rebels. A provisional regency composed of 5 members replaced the Sevilla junta, an organized means of defense before which the efforts of the French troops failed. No better success awaited King Joseph's conciliatory measures, so that important war port, Cadiz, key to all the provinces of the south of Spain, became the center of the resistance of the peninsula. In Portugal, Marshal Massena, detained during a month before the lines of Torres Vedras, was forced by famine, disease, and daily encounters which decimated his army by reducing it to the saddest extremities, to approach his victualling centers, to beat a retreat, and finally to evacuate Portugal. He was followed by the English general who recaptured Ciudad Rodrigo and Badajoz. Partial insurrections increased in number, and guerrillas covered the whole Spanish territory. The recall of the Imperial Guard and of several regiments. The rumors of an imminent rupture between France and Russia had raised the courage of the Spanish rebels. Famine was reigning in Madrid and in the provinces owing to the difficulty of communication. The emperor, before leaving to undertake his campaign in Russia, had handed over the command of the French troops in Spain to King Joseph. Napoleon had restored Marshal Jourdan to his brother, with whom the king agreed better than with Marshal Soult. This combination of occurrences shows how greatly the emperor must have felt the necessity of finishing the war in Spain. At last, but feeble hope remained to him. Since 1809, Austria had been keeping an agent, Baron de Weissenberg, in London, with whom it was possible to communicate by Calais. The proposal which Napoleon transmitted to London through this agent had for its principal object the evacuation of the Spanish territory by the French and English armies and the independence of this country under the present dynasty. The negotiation was a very short one, for Lord Castlereagh answered that if the exclusion of Ferdinand VII and his heirs was maintained, the engagement undertaken by the British government did not allow him to accede to the proposal of the French government. This very plain-spoken declaration broke off the negotiation at its commencement. Napoleon unfortunately thought himself sufficiently strong to carry on 2 such gigantic enterprises at the same time. Alliances with Austria and Prussia became necessary to France before entering on the campaign and sending her armies into Russia. Prussia, hemmed in between 2 giants ready to dash against each other, had made fruitless remonstrances to St. Petersburg's cabinet to avert war, despairing of preventing a conflict in which either the remaining neutral or by acting in a hostile manner towards France, the Prussian monarchy ran the risk of definitely disappearing. The Prussian government made up its mind to solicit from the French cabinet an alliance which it had declined at a time when it would have been very useful. But this time the royal government used all its powers to bring it about, although Napoleon could have no real trust in a cabinet which only asked for an alliance with France because it was out of power to wage war upon us. A purely defensive treaty of alliance was signed with Prussia on February 24th, 1812. The king undertook to supply the French army with a contingent of 20,000 men. One of the secret clauses of the treaty revealed the mistrust which, on the part of France, was so justified by the conduct of Prussia in 1806. This power, by a clause in the treaty, deprived itself of the power of making any levy of men or of ordering any movement of troops without having previously concerted with France. Offering easier terms to Austria, the emperor concluded a treaty with her on March 14th of the same year. The contingent of the Austrian monarchy was fixed at 30,000 men. One of the secret clauses stipulated that if, as a consequence of the war, the Kingdom of Poland should be reestablished, Austria would agree to cede a part of Galicia to be added to this kingdom in exchange for the Illyrian provinces, which France then and there agreed to abandon to her by way of compensation. In the case of a happy issue of the war, France also promised to procure to Austria indemnities and increase of territory, which would not only compensate her for the cooperation in this war, but which would also be a monument of the intimate and lasting union which existed between the two sovereigns. Negotiations were at the time carried on with Sweden, who by her geographical position in threatening Russia with a formidable diversion, covered the left of our army. But these negotiations were entirely lacking in good faith on the part of the Stockholm cabinet. And to give the proof of this at once, I will mention that whilst the Crown Prince was haggling with us over his help against Russia, May 29, 1812, he had signed a treaty of alliance with that power 2 months previously, namely on March 24th. The Swedish cabinet had frequently warned that if Pomerania continued to serve as a market for English trade and as a receptacle of the libelous publications directed against France, the French government would be obliged to occupy this province. No satisfactory answer having been received on this subject, Prince d'Aquemule d'Avaux, commanding the French troops in the Hanseatic provinces, had possession taken of Stralsund on January 30th by a premature interpretation of instructions which had been given him against British commerce. Marshal Davout was authorized to take this step by the continual traffic which was going on between Stralsund and Heligoland, a rock near the coast, which had become a rich storehouse of English ammunitions, goods, and libelous publications, and the hotbed of active intrigues. The occupation of Pomerania foreseen at Stockholm was considered inevitable. A great deal of noise, however, was made about it there. The Crown Prince, who at that time was already engaged in a very advanced pourparlers with Russia, offered to break them off on a condition which he knew to be unacceptable. He asked that France should guarantee him the acquisition of Norway by despoiling Denmark, our most faithful ally, whose possessions we had guaranteed. The Emperor Alexander, in order to attach Sweden to the coalition, had promised the Crown Prince to hand Norway over to him in compensation for the annexation of Finland to Russia. England, constant to her hatred for Denmark on account of the fidelity of this state to the French alliance, not content with ratifying this promise, had further undertaken to help Sweden in the conquest of Norway. The perseverance of the Crown Prince in his pretensions on his country did not stop Napoleon in his negotiations with the Stockholm cabinet. He employed every means to reach Bernadotte's heart and to recall him to a sense of duty and of his true interests. The emperor even caused the Princess Royale, who was at that time in Paris, to act upon her husband with this purpose in view. Napoleon has been reproached for having left the letters which the Crown Prince addressed him unanswered for several weeks. The emperor's communications with the Swedish cabinet had perhaps to be waited for at first, but they were always calm, dignified, and marked by a spirit of conciliation. which gives a denial to the charge of haughtiness and bitterness which has been directed against them. The proof of this will be found in the notes which were exchanged between the two governments, notes which were published after 1815. Napoleon undertook not to conclude peace until the restitution of Finland to Sweden had been obtained. If the Crown Prince, having other objects in view, could not accept this proposal, nothing in any case prevented him from remaining neutral. Honor, the constancy of France's goodwill towards Sweden, the gratitude due from Bernadotte to his first country, a gratitude which nothing rendered incompatible with his new duties, all his past, in one word, imposed neutrality at least, but his feelings of hatred got the upper hand. Bernadotte did not content himself with declaring against France. He did more. He sent into the wilds of America for an accomplice in his desertion, General Moreau, and obtained not only the cessation of Norway, but also of Guadeloupe, the restitution of which France only obtained in 1814. I speak here for the last time of the relations of the Empire with the Crown Prince of Sweden, in spite of the fact that these perfidious negotiations, for they merit this appellation, continued till the month of June, 1814. Napoleon's cutting saying about Bernadotte is known. One is not obliged to deny one's mother in taking a wife, and still less to wish to stab her in the heart. The defection of Turkey was caused by the belief with which the divan had been inspired that France was abandoning her alliance for an alliance with Russia, and by the absence at this decisive moment of our ambassador to the Sublime Porte. Since the month of January 1812, a man eminently French, who from his mission to Turkey had kept up relations from which he obtained valuable and reliable information, the Chevalier Amédée Joubert, alarmed at the warnings which his private letters from Constantinople gave him of the ever-growing influence exercised on the divan by the Russians, took it upon himself to acquaint the Minister of Foreign Affairs with the matter. This minister, struck by a state of things the gravity of which had not been revealed to him by his agents, consulted the emperor on the subject. Napoleon's keen-sightedness, which rarely was at fault, impressed him with the necessity of having at Constantinople an ambassador whose word would have greater weight than that of a simple chargé d'affaires. He accordingly immediately appointed General Andriossi ambassador to Turkey. This envoy left for Laibach, where he stopped waiting to receive the usual presents, which he was to take with him, and without which he did not wish to present himself before the Turkish authorities. In the meanwhile, the skillful Russian diplomacy had not remained idle. Intrigues and corruption had gained ground and made progress, which the authority of a French ambassador would probably have checked. The emperor, since the month of June, had not ceased insisting that Constantinople should be apprised by every means of his march against Russia, so as to prop up the wavering faith of the divan. I will not pronounce on the question to what cause the prolonged stay of Andriossi at Laibach must be attributed. The ambassador left it at last and hastened on with all diligence. But though he accomplished a part of the way at full speed, he only managed to reach Terapia on July 25th. A fictitious letter from Napoleon to the Emperor Alexander, proposing as the first clause of a treaty of peace, the division of Turkey, was put under the eyes of the Grand Vizier. Joseph Fontaine, a dragoman in the pay of England, consulted by Ghalib Effendi, attested the authenticity of this document. The fact of General Narbonne's presence at Vilna helped to finally make up the mind of the Ottoman minister and of the Sultan, who till then had refused to ratify the treaty of preliminaries of which, signed by the plenipotentiaries of the Porte and of Russia at Bucharest, May 25th, had arrived in Constantinople on June 6th. It was only the following 14th of July that the Sultan decided to ratify the treaty which was to become so fatal to us. The error, or the treachery, of the Grand Vizier, which had been so prejudicial to us, was punished, though not repaid, by the loss of his head and the execution of the perfidious agents who had advised him. The ambassador Andriossi only arrived in Constantinople 10 days later. In the course of March 1812, the emperor, surmounting the feeling of repulsion with which Monsieur de Talleyrand's spirit of intrigue had filled him, had the idea of sending him to Warsaw. He approached him confidentially on the subject, recommending him not to mention it. Shortly afterwards, Napoleon learned that ducats were being bought at Vienna on account of his minister, and that the secret of his mission had become known. The emperor, displeased at seeing his plan exposed, and considering this domestic arrangement as a proof of collusion and a kind of stock-jobbing speculation on the Viennese public funds, abandoned the choice he had made and appointed Abbé Prat, who had followed him to Dresden, in Prince de Benevento's place. The emperor strongly desired that the contingent supplied by Austria should be placed under the command of Prince Schwarzenberg, who had been ambassador to Paris since 1809, and asked that the rank of field marshal might be given him with this purpose in view, as the prince was one of the youngest generals of the cavalry in active service. This request was evaded, and some private correspondence ensued between the two emperors. The Emperor of Austria, having alleged the rigor of military regulations, consented to be agreeable to Napoleon, whilst taking care to make it known that the nomination of Prince Charles Schwarzenberg was only due to his respect for the recommendation of his nephew, the Emperor of the French. The answer to the message of reconciliation with which the emperor had charged Colonel Chernichev at the time of that officer's departure from Paris for St. Petersburg only arrived 6 weeks later at the Tuileries. It was Russia's ultimatum. The following were the conditions thereof. The Emperor Alexander imposed on the Emperor Napoleon as an obligation which must precede all negotiations: the evacuation by the French troops of all Prussian states and of Swedish Pomerania, that is to say, the throwing open of the forts of the Oder and of the Danzig to Russian invasion. These conditions having been fulfilled, Russia would consent to treat on a basis which should put no obstacle in the way of the admission of neutrals into Russian harbors, promising not to aggravate the prohibitive measures which the Russian government had thought fit to decree for the advantage of its commerce. This St. Petersburg cabinet declared itself ready to conclude an arrangement in favor of Sweden, and finally to accept, in exchange for the surrender of the Duchy of Oldenburg, some equivalent compensation. This notification, offensive in its form rather than its contents, seemed so strange to Napoleon that he suspected that it must be the result of some intrigue like the one which had just resulted in the banishment of Speransky, the privy councillor. The injunction to evacuate Germany without any treaty having previously stipulated the terms of this evacuation deeply wounded the emperor's pride. It was with no sincere desire for peace that the character and dignity of such a sovereign as Napoleon were put to such a test. In 1806, the King of Prussia had forgotten himself to the point of notifying a similar summons to him. Never had Napoleon, in the course of his brilliant victories, dreamed of making such insulting demands on his adversaries. A note drawn up in the sense of the proposals, which we have mentioned, was handed in Paris by Prince Kurakin, the Russian ambassador, to Duke Bassano, Minister of Foreign Affairs, Murray, who evaded all discussion on this basis. Prince Kurakin asked for an audience with the emperor, a request which could not be refused. The emperor hid his resentment. He attributed, he said, the communications made by the ambassador solely to a misunderstanding, which he was anxious to clear up before entering upon any explanations, and added that he reserved to himself to write on this subject to the Emperor of Russia. Napoleon, with this object in view, sent Count Narbonne off to St. Petersburg at once, charged with the mission of endeavoring to find out the secret of the Tsar's action, and to discover whether there remained no means of coming to an understanding with Russia. In Paris, Prince Kurakin pressed for the acceptance of his proposals and demanded his passports in case of refusal, but only received evasive answers from Monsieur de Bassano. Whilst matters were in this state, the emperor left for Dresden, whither he was followed some days later by Monsieur de Bassano. As to Prince Kurakin, he withdrew to the country to await his passports. These were not sent to him, so as not to break off all relations with Russia.